And we bow and we bend from the beginning of the world till the never end. O Devo Shalom Aleinu, O Devo Shalom Aleinu, Devo Shalom Aleinu ve'al kulam. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everyone, depending upon when you're watching this. Welcome to our session on Simchat Torah. There is a blessing in the morning that we say when we first get up. And it's a blessing for the studying of Torah. And so I did that already this morning. And what's interesting is it's not exactly Torah that comes after that blessing in the prayer book, but we'll talk about that. And the blessing is Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We are in awe, we are in wonder within the oneness of all from which we glean our mandates in life, one of which is to busy ourselves in the study of Torah, to do the work really of the study of Torah. So it's really a beautiful introduction to the day to make sure that you study Torah every day. And Torah, of course, with my definition, not of course, but with my definition is much broader. There's Torah in Old Testament and New Testament, in Quran, in the writings of Baha'u'llah, who's the founder of Baha'i, as you may know, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's everywhere. But more importantly, I do think it's really crucial in some ways to start our day off with that intentionality that we're going to study. Okay, so here comes what we're going to study. There it is. Okay.
Yeah.
And I want to do a slideshow. We're going to do it from the beginning. Okay. All right. So literally speaking, Simchat Torah, it should be Simchat. I actually blew that already. It should have a T at the end. Simchat Torah means joy of the Torah. Joy of the Torah. Here's a Torah slightly unrolled. You really can't quite see the text, but I'll show that to you later. I did receive a question recently as to whether, or not we really read from this scroll every week, and we do. These scrolls are written by someone called a sofer, S-O-F-E-R, and a sofer actually will take about a year or two to write a Torah. It is made from lamb skin, as you might be able to see. And I don't know, can I make this larger for you? Is that something I can do? Anybody know? Well, maybe I can do this. That work? Yeah?
Yeah. It's
Okay, good. So you can see that there are columns. You can, I don't think you can see one of the lambskin. Oh, this is it, right? Right here is a seam. And behind that seam are a couple of Band-Aid looking things that are also made out of lambskin that are glued on to support the seam, and the seam is sewn together with lamb sinew, with sheep sinew. So it's still the old style, the way we do it. As you may know, the representative word for God that we use, Yud He Vav He, occurs many, many times, thousands of times in the Torah, and every time the sofer does that, he has to be very, very careful, because if he doesn't scribe it correctly, he actually has to throw away the whole section and start over.
Oh.
The other thing about what a sofer does is they write, now Hebrew of course is written right to left, yeah, okay? The sofer actually inscribes it left to right so that he can avoid memorizing any of the sections, okay? So because if he does it from memory, he might make a mistake. And so we don't want him to make a mistake. So he does it backwards, which is really quite a feat in and of itself. Okay, let's go to the next slide.
Even though you read it from right there.
Okay, let me take it down again. Whoop, disappeared. Hello. Okay. All right, so we'll go to the next slide. Good. So this is what's called the Sefer Torah, which is often translated as a Torah scroll, but it's Sefer means book, because in those times scrolls were books. So this is called the whole thing is called the Sefer Torah. This is called a keter. That's a crown. These are called rimonim. And that means pomegranate, because it sort of has the shape of the pomegranate. And I don't know if you could see it on this one. I'll make it bigger. You see the bells, right? It makes a beautiful sound as it's paraded around the synagogue. We always parade it around the synagogue before we read it, and after we read it as well. Let's see. There's also a breastplate on the Torah scroll, and you can see that as well. I happen to like Torah scrolls decorated with the rimonim more than I do the keter. I find that the keter is kind of ostentatious. The rimonim are a little bit more subtle. I like that better. These, by the way, the rollers are called atzei chaim, trees of life. Trees of life. Because the Torah is called a tree of life. The phrase is, in our tradition, it is a tree of life to them that hold fast to it. And all of its supporters are happy. So even though goodness is the goal, right? Okay. So here's a Torah scroll opened up so that you can see the component parts a little bit. This is completely out of what do I want to say? It's not to scale. This is much bigger than what it usually would be. This is called a yad, because yad means hand, and you can see at the end of it, there's a hand with the finger pointing. Usually made out of precious metals. It can also be made out of wood. It can be made out of bone, but it cannot be made with any kind of a metal that is used for warfare. So that is out. Okay. My mouse is somehow plotzing. That's a good Yiddish word to know. Plotzing. Yes.
In there.
So there it is. All right. And this is all bunched up here, but it has a horrible name in Yiddish. It's called a wimple, and a wimple is what you tie the Torah with. It was an old tradition to take a baby's swaddling clothes and clean them all up, and then decorate it and donate it to the synagogue for a wimple. Because when we put the Torah away, we want to roll it nice and tight so that none of the pages get wrinkled. None of the scroll gets wrinkled. I don't know if I open this up a little bit. There isn't a seam there. Okay. All right. And by the way, the wimple now can be made out of anything, right? Anything. Now, again, right to left, just keep in mind, this underneath here, if you roll all the way down, this is the beginning of the Torah, right? And this is the end. This would be a time of the year when we lift the Torah straight up like this from the handles at the bottom of the Atzei Chaim, of the trees of life, right up. After the Torah reading, someone comes up and lifts it like that. This time of year, you need somebody who's right-handed, because this is going to be heavier than this side. Yeah. Okay. This is a Sephardic Torah dressing. Sometimes wood, but there is wood underneath here anyway, but sometimes the wood is overlaid with silver or gold or both, or semi-precious stones or even precious stones. And of course, when they open it up, the text is right here, right? So it's right there. And you can actually read it standing up. So this other kind of Torah, the best kind of reading stand for it is going to be slanted, and you lie it down so you can read it. This one, you can read just standing up. Now this, by the way, is a combination of a crown and remaining. On this one, really quite elaborate and quite beautiful. So mostly this will be used by Jews from Spanish background, which means those are Sephardic Jews. So that's anywhere where the Spanish Empire, Spanish Armada landed. So that's Portugal and Spain, and later Yemen and Turkey and other places in the Middle East, right? So those will be the kind that they use. All right, so this is what Hebrew looks like in the modern context, and certainly in the prayer book itself. If you remember, these larger elements are the consonants, and these little guys down below are the vowels. Now, this one is not a vowel. It's actually called a trope mark, and the trope marks were initially grammatical. They were used for grammatical phrasing, and I'll show you in just one moment exactly why, so that you would know sort of where you were in the sentence. And later, in order to beautify the service and emphasize the Torah reading, every trope mark like this one, and here's that other one going backwards or forwards, and that one, and let's see where else. There's some other ones that are more fancy. There's that one and that one that looks like a little wishbone. And this one is also a trope mark. There's a set of notes for each one of them. And it enables you to sing the word. And wherever the trope mark is on the word, that's the syllable that gets emphasized. Okay? So now what I want to show you is this is what the text looks like in the Torah. There are no vowels. There are no trope marks. So if you're going to read this or sing this, you really need to memorize what's underneath. Now, the other thing about that is that if you know Hebrew, you will sort of be able to tell what's going on, because you'll be translating it as you go along. But just in case, you become very, very familiar with the vowels and very, very familiar with the trope marks so that you can chant it all the way through. Now, these little crowns, by the way, are the style of scribing in a Torah text. There actually is an interpretation for each one of these. Each of these little crowns, all the way through the Torah, not just this one, right? But it's this one on this word in this place, okay? And really the origin of them, we don't know at all. We really don't know. Now, I also want to show you, these are the lines that the sofer etches into the lambskin, the parchment, so that he can, and it's always a he at this point. So these, and there's one down here, right? So he stays within the lines. He stays within the lines. Of course, when he gets to some very, very special portions of the Torah, he will actually take a break, go to the mikvah, the ritual bath, and still wet will come back and finish that part of the text, because he needs to spiritually cleanse himself by going to the mikvah. It's really quite elaborate and wonderful. All right. These are the books of the Torah that you may know: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, right? In that order. And notice I got one with a very nice equal sign down here. So All of these added up equals Torah. Isn't that nice? Okay. The 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, right? As it's often referred to. But the Torah does not equal the Holy Scriptures. Not the same thing. This is the first 5 books of the Jewish Bible, the Hebrew Bible. This has 39 books in it. Okay. And here are the 3 sections of this text: the 5 books of Moses, the prophets, and the Ketuvim, the book of writings. Okay, so you already know what's in here: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. Anybody, you can unmute yourself. You know, a very easy way to unmute yourself is just push the space bar on your keyboard. If you push the space bar on your keyboard, you can tell me one of the prophets who's in here. No, you have to hold it down, Virginia.
Samuel.
Samuel is definitely in there. Good.
Isaiah.
Isaiah's one in there. Any other ones? Well, you'll see in a minute. How's that?
Daniel.
Daniel's here, believe it or not. And we'll talk about why. Okay. All right. So these are the books that are here. Oh, sorry. I keep forgetting that I'm not like actually viewing it. Okay, but I am viewing it. All right, so these are the major texts: Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And then you have all the minor ones. And this Nevi'im, Achronim, this at the very side means the older texts, okay? So it's Hosea, it's Yoel, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Yonah, Micha, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, and Zechariah, and Malachi. So these are all of the texts that you have as prophetic texts. So this represents really a whole, it's not only a genre, it's an era of Jewish experience when there were prophets extant in the civilization who could act as a barometer on our ethical behavior, sometimes very personally, as was done with Moses, but with David, but not here. All right, so Psalms, Proverbs, and Job. That's wisdom literature, according to us. Psalms probably was written by King David or a cohort of people who called themselves King David. Proverbs, we think, was written by Solomon, and in his older age, but not completely old. That's when we get to Ecclesiastes. Job. Job is this incredible story, but he's not a prophet. The Song of Songs, which is actually the sexiest book in the Bible. If you read it carefully, you'll see that it uses all this agrarian imagery to talk about the two lovers in the story say about one another, and when we get to the Talmud, you'll understand that word more. But later in the Talmud, when the Torah, when the Bible was being redacted, which was between the year 70 when the temple was destroyed by the Romans, that was the Second Temple, between the year 70 and about the year 90, when the Torah was redacted, there was this huge argument as to whether or not to include Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, in the Bible. Now, there are debates about all of these, and you need to know that all of these were holy, quasi-holy, and holy texts that were floating around. Nobody was going to argue that Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy should be included in the in the Bible, but some of these were a question mark. The Song of Songs was the biggest one because the word God is not mentioned in the Song of Songs, and so the rabbis finally made an argument that the Song of Songs is actually the man in the story is God, and the woman in the story is the Jewish people, and it describes the love relationship between them. And it was in, you may know that there are official Christian interpretations that do similarly, that interpret the woman in the story being those who accept Jesus and as the Messiah, and that God is the male. Jesus is the male. The book of Ruth, also a lovely lady, not a prophet. Okay. This, by the way, her story is our paradigm story for conversion. The book of Lamentations was written after the temple was destroyed the first time. After the temple was destroyed the first time by the Babylonians in the year 586 BC, as most people call it, or we do BCE, before the Common Era, because we don't mark time by the birth of Jesus, so we use BCE, before the Common Era that we all use. So the Book of Lamentations was actually written on the road on the road to captivity in Babylonia, and later in captivity in Babylonia. And keep Babylonia in mind, we're going to need it later. So this is Kohelet, this is Ecclesiastes, this is when we think King Solomon was very, very old, and was kind of cynical about life. And he wrote this book, Kohelet, which is vanity, vanity, all is vanity. Also, there is nothing new under the sun. These are, not very positive statements, but if you take it as an old man reflecting on the finality of death that's approaching, then you see it a little bit clearer and understand it a little bit more in the historical and personal context. Esther, also very nice lady, not a prophet, but she also was, this book too doesn't mention God, and she was definitely a heroine, but there are no prophets or anything like that in this text. Here's Daniel. Daniel is part of Jewish history because of the oppression that he experienced under occupation. So that's part of our history, as is Ezra and Nehemiah, who rebuilt the temple after it was destroyed the first time. This was during an era when we did have pairs of prophets, because one was sort of the administrator, and one was the more prophetic voice. In this case, it was Nehemiah who was the more prophetic voice, and Ezra was the administrator, which didn't mean that he didn't speak prophetically as well. And Chronicles is the kind of the kolbo, that's Hebrew, kind of like the marketplace of prophetic ideas that follow. Okay, good. Now, good, we did the whole thing. All right, good. Now, this is the Shema. This is the center of Jewish prayer. And it comes, as you can see, out of the book of Deuteronomy. And it's going to become our study text for today. And so you can see the traditional translation here. Hear, O Israel, the eternal is our God, the eternal alone. Even a more common translation is the eternal is one. And then these paragraphs follow right after verse 4 in chapter 6 of Deuteronomy. You shall love the eternal your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. I know that this text is common in Christian liturgy and in instruction texts often as well. Take to heart these instructions which I charge you to this day. Impress them or teach them to your children. This, by the way, is the Jewish and Christian proof text for why we should vote for Proposition 15. They are saying it's on the California ballot, which will undo much of the damage of Prop 13, and we'll start getting support for teaching these things to our children that hasn't been there since the passage of Prop 13. Recite them when you stay at home, when you're on your way. That's these words, yeah? When you lie down and when you get up. This is going to be crucial for our study. That's why it's in blue, so don't forget it. Bind them as a sign on your hand. Let them serve as a symbol on your forehead. Inscribe them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. You might think that this is metaphorical. Bind them as a sign on your hand and a symbol on your forehead. The rabbis said, well, we can't take it metaphorically, so they actually made prayer things. They're called tefillin. That's literally what that means, prayer things. And they are boxes that are actually made out of leather with parchment inside. And the parchment has this text and some others. You actually do wrap it around your head and you wrap it around your arm. The box is here and it actually goes all the way down and wraps around your hand. And when you're wrapped that way, there's very little else that you can do besides either pray or study. That's just why they're called prayer things. Okay. The Mishnah was the first huge text that was written to explain the laws of the Torah. Let me give you an example from some of our study before. If you remember, when we talked about Shabbat, we said that the rabbis, and that will be in the Mishnah and later in the Talmud as well, delineated 39 different categories of work that you can't do on Shabbat, on the Sabbath, that you may not do. The reason that they came up with that is because when it tells you to observe the Shabbat, to do the Shabbat, but not do any work, they said, well, that's very confusing, right? How are we going to explain that to anybody? What is work? And so they looked at the building of the tabernacle in the desert, the portable sanctuary that we built, and they delineated 39 categories of work from that. That's in the Mishnah. But there'll also be something here later about the Shema that we'll look at in a minute. The first major written collection of oral traditions known as the Oral Torah. It's called the Oral Torah because it was originally transmitted as an oral text. People actually memorized the discussions that the early rabbis had and would pass it from person to person or from school to school. The Mishnah was, of course, later written down, redacted by Judah Hanasi at the beginning of the 3rd century CE, in a time when, according to the Talmud, which is the later text, the persecution of the Jews in the passage of time raised the possibility that the details of the oral traditions of the Pharisees, that's the rabbinic group, from the Second Temple period, 536 BCE to 70 CE, would be forgotten. Most of the Mishnah is written in Mishnaic Hebrew. Some parts are in Aramaic. I need to stop myself from doing that. Okay, so what I wanted to emphasize is that it starts pretty early, 3rd century CE. So the Torah and the prophetic texts and the writings are already canonized. They're already redacted and put together, which books are in, which books are out. But now we start looking at the 613 commandments of the Torah. So that is a major task and a major piece of work. It makes the laws of the Torah more applicable to daily life and more immediate so people can really understand them. Okay. Now, this is the beginning of the Mishnah, and it refers to what we were just looking at. Remember, when you lie down and when you rise up. From what time may one recite the Shema in the evening? From the time that the priests entered their houses in order to eat their truma, I'll explain that, until the end of the first watch, the words of Rabbi Eliezer. Okay, so the truma was a sacrifice that was made during the day in the tabernacle or the temple, later the temple in Jerusalem, and parts of it were left over for the priests and their families to eat because otherwise they would have nothing. They didn't eat all day. Neither did their families until they brought this home. So, let's say the truma, when they enter their houses, it's probably around sunset. The end of the first watch refers to a watch around a walled city when you have those guards walking around the city, and each one will take a 3-hour shift or so. So we can say this is about 6 and this is about 9, something like that, okay? Rabban Gamliel, who, by the way, is the head of all of these rabbis talking. He is the head of what was called the Sanhedrin, which was a group of 70 rabbis gathered together to make decisions on Jewish law during the time of the Mishnah. And as you can imagine, there were a lot of opinions thrown around. If they say 2 Jews in a room, you have 3 opinions. Imagine, it's 70. It gets compounded. But Gamliel was the head of the Sanhedrin, and he said that he extended this from 9 o'clock in the evening until midnight. Okay, and here's his story. Once it happened that his sons, that's Rabbi Gamliel's sons, came home late from a wedding feast, and they said to him, "Gee, Dad, we haven't had a chance to say the evening Shema yet because we were all, just in this party and everything was happening. It was really fun." And he said to them, "If it's not yet dawn, you are still obligated to recite it." Now, again, I don't want you, I want you to see this word obligated. This is, it says, you shall say these words when you lie down and when you rise up. That's a mandate. That's one of the 613. It's not a maybe. It's not, when I'll do this prayer this day and another one the other day. It's every day, morning and evening, but when in the morning and when in the evening. By the way, who's asking this question? Which group of people doing what job? And you can unmute yourselves to participate. Who is asking this question of the rabbis? Lay people doing some job in society. Who is asking the question of what's the latest I can say the Shema, really is what they want to know. Anybody? It's farmers. Farmers need all the light that they can get. And in those ancient days, they didn't have any lights that they could light up to do their repairs on their machinery or any extra things they needed to do in the field. As you've seen on some farms, they didn't have any of that. And when it was dark, it was really dark. There was no extra reflective light from a city or anything like that. So, that's who's asking the question. They need to make sure that they can use every inch of light during the day so that they can compete effectively in the marketplace. And he said, if it's not yet dawn, you're still obligated to recite, and not in respect to this alone, Did they say so? Did they so decide? But wherever the sages say until midnight, the mitzvah may be performed until dawn. Now, now this is an easy question. It's an either or. So, are the rabbis trying to make Judaism, in this case, saying the Shema, easier or harder?
I would say easier.
Because?
I would say both.
Well, I want to get to the easier first.
They're giving you more time to do it.
They're giving you more time. That's why it can't be both. Okay. They're giving you more and more time to get it done because they don't want to be they don't want the commandments to be impossible to observe. Okay. And this is part of why the rabbis kind of wove themselves into the text to make it something that was, not just legalese, as it were. When you say, don't worry about what's in the fine print, just sign this contract. The rabbis created the details so that people could understand it. We really don't need to do this last part, but it is similar, okay? Okay. And here's the important part though. Why then did the sages say until midnight, if you can do it, until dawn, in order to keep a person far from transgression? What does that mean? You put a fence around the Torah. If you remember when we were talking about Shabbat actually begins 18 minutes before sundown in order that you don't get even close to transgressing Shabbat by lighting the candles too late. Okay, so you can light it at 19 minutes before sundown or 20 minutes before sundown, but not 16 minutes before sundown. Okay. All right, the Mishnah plus the Gemara equals the Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud, the Talmud Bavli, consists of documents compiled over the period of late antiquity, 3rd to 6th centuries. You remember the Mishnah was begun in the 3rd century. During this time, the most important of the Jewish centers in Mesopotamia, a region called Babylonia, in Jewish sources and later known as Iraq. Okay, so why Babylonia? Where did the Jews go to after they were exiled from the first destruction of the temple? What country?
Well,
Where'd they go?
Babylon.
Babylonia, exactly. So by the waters of Babylon, there we sat down and wept. That's from Echa, that's from Lamentations. Okay, so they went to Babylonia, and they some of them stayed. Some of them did not go back after Cyrus the Great defeated Babylonia. And so they stayed. They were ensconced there. They'd been there for some 50 years already. And so, they had families, they had businesses, they stayed. And it became a huge hub for Judaism. The Babylonian Talmud comprises the Mishnah and the Babylonian Gemara, the later representing the culmination of more than 300 years of analysis of the Mishnah, as we saw, okay? Now, this is the one that we normally use. And the reason this is the one that we normally use, there's a Jerusalem Talmud also, but the Jerusalem Talmud is laden with the perspective of the priests. The Babylonian Talmud is a people's Talmud, because it was written outside of Israel. And the rabbis, certainly by the 1st century BCE, kind of knew that the days of the Jews in Israel were numbered because of the power of the Roman Empire, who was then occupying. And so they began to make Judaism portable. That's the magic of this text. It's a non-temple oriented text. Even though they will preserve all of the commandments that have to do with the temple, that are sort of hanging, in limbo in the air, right? They're in cyberspace somewhere. That what the rabbis did was they said, this Judaism you can take on the road. All right. Now this is what a page of Talmud looks like. Here, right here is the Mishnah in the middle. This is the older text, the one that's from 300 to 600 CE, right? All right. And the Gemara on this page, right there. So this is the text we just read, right? About when you can say the Shema in the evening. This is Talmudic commentary on the text, right? And you're going to need to trust me that it goes on for 10 pages back to back from here, okay? What are these things around the side? Any guesses? These are commentaries on the commentary. So the Gemara is a commentary to the Mishnah, and all of these are commentaries on both. And many of them are from the early to later Middle Ages, okay? And they're different ones here. You have to kind of know how to decipher and where they split up, but they're all over. Okay, so let's look at Rashi. Rashi, as you can see, was essentially, 11th and 12th century France. He commented, he wrote a complete Bible and a Talmudic commentary as well. When thou liest down, one might think that this means if one lies down, retires to bed in the middle of the day, and that, when you rise up means that even if you rise up in the middle of the night. It, however, states when you sit in your house and when you walk by the way, that precedes the text. The Torah is thus speaking of the usual way of living. And this therefore means the usual time of lying down and the usual time of rising up. In other words, what most people do, not somebody, who does night work, okay? The night shift. This is for people who usually work during the day, come home, sit in your house when you're home, when you then go to sleep, and when you walk, by the way, when you go to your work, or before when you go to your work in the morning. So this is Rashi's interpretation of the text, and it's a very nice one. People want to know. So what if I take a nap during the day? Do I need to kind of like redo it? And they'll say, well, what if I'm not home? And so on and so forth. Rashi makes it very clear. But Ibn Ezra, there are some question marks about when he was born, as you can see, and when he died. He was born in Toledo, Toledo, northern Spain, Tudela. And when you lie down to sleep, for no commandments apply to someone who's actually sleeping. Thus, we see that speak of them includes both speech and thought. In other words, when you think about these things when you're about to lie down, right? You're not teaching them specifically, you're not speaking about them to anyone, right? But you're thinking about them on your own. So he says that even when you ruminate during the day, when you're ruminating on the Shema, and it's 2 paragraphs following, there's actually more texts in the traditional Shema, that what you're doing is you're fulfilling the idea of lying down. Okay. This is later from the Shulchan Aruch. This is definitely a medieval text. It was an Ashkenazi text, that is Eastern European, it's a Sephardic text. And the Ashkenazim, it was supposed to be, Shulchan Aruch means the set table. Here it is, everybody, it's all set. You got to figure it out. And the Eastern Europeans took a look at it and they said, well, it's not exactly the way we do it. So they wrote a commentary to it. So The time of reciting the morning Shema is from when one can see a slightly familiar friend at a distance of four amot and can recognize him. Okay, so question, why is it a slightly familiar friend? Because you would recognize your familiar friend more easily, okay? And amot was an ancient distance, and I don't know exactly how far it was. And it continues until the end of 3 halachic hours, okay? That time span, okay? Halachic means Jewish law. Until the end of 3 Jewish law hours, which is a fourth of the day, okay? The fourth of a light time day. The most ideal fulfillment of the mitzvah is to read it like the Vatikim, the experienced ones, the students and Rashi people who are humble and love the commandments, who would prepare to recite it a little before the budding of the sun, right? As soon as the coming of the sun, this beautiful metaphor like pomegranates, in order that one should finish the recitation of the Shema and its blessings with the budding of the sun, and to join the prayer, which is, well, we'll talk about it when we do a prayer session. It's the major section of prayer in the middle of the service, to it immediately to the budding of the sun. Whoever is able to prepare to do this, his reward will be very great. The measurement of the budding of the sun is about 1 hour before the entire body or the disk of the sun has ascended over the land. So here's another question, right? When is sundown? And when is sunrise, okay? So when you start seeing the very little tip of the disk of either the sun or the moon, right? Then it's either daytime or nighttime. By the way, this is all another common interpretation of this is when you can tell the difference between red and green. Yeah, because red and green refract light very similarly. So try that if you get up early enough to try and see the difference between things that you don't know what color they are. Have somebody else put it out for you at night, and we'll see if it's red or green. Okay. Now, this has to do when you say the Shema in the morning, which, as we just talked about, was saying it when the disk of the sun is just above the land, just above the horizon. Okay. This is from the Central Conference of American Rabbis. Pardon me, that's my group of people. That's Reform rabbis in the contemporary sense. This is our commentary. So if I have a question, for instance, from my congregation, I will send it to rabbis a group of rabbis who've been deemed by the movement as scholars, as really authorities in this, and they will debate, and then they'll come up with a written response, which is why this is called responsa material. Okay, all of the books of responsa that they have. Now, by the way, the Jewish prayer book is actually a piece of responsa material. It was created by Rav Amram, who was the chief rabbi of Vilna, in the 9th century, about the middle of the 9th century, which is really late for Jews, right? Really late in Jewish history. There wasn't a prayer book before then. And instead, when people asked him, so what prayers come, what's the order of prayers? He said, I'll tell you what, I'll write the whole thing. And that's what he did. And which is basically the order and everything that we use today. A congregant has asked that a Sabbath morning service during which her daughter will lead the congregation in worship as a bat mitzvah, will read Torah, the Haftarah, which is the prophetic books that we read after the Torah portion, and offer a Devar Torah, meaning a sermon. Literally, this means a word of Torah. Begin as late in the morning as possible, perhaps as late as 11:30 or even 12 noon. She makes this request so that her elderly and ill father, the grandfather of the bat mitzvah, will be able to participate and to fully appreciate the service and the efforts of his granddaughter as she demonstrates her commitment to Judaism as a young Jewish adult. He is suffering from a severe illness, and it is not and is not fully aware until late in the morning or early afternoon. The family and the bat mitzvah want to participate in a Sabbath morning service as they feel that it is more rewarding than the shorter afternoon, that's mincha, afternoon service, okay? All right, so I'll bet you have an answer right away. Of course, do it later, right? Let's just do that. Let's do it for her. Let's do it for the family, certainly for grandpa. Let's make it easy on them. But that's not that's not the way you make decisions like this in Judaism. You start from the bottom up rather than starting in the middle of the air where you sort of would like your answer to be. You start at the bottom and see if the progression leads you to that place. It may not, okay? So watch what even the Reform movement, the liberal movement, the progressive movement in Judaism does. Flagship service is the Friday night, and so this is a real question asked from Rabbi Harry D. Rothstein in Utica, New York. Okay, Teshuvah, meaning the answer. This she'elah, this question, in addition to the particular case it addresses, raises a more general issue. It is the common custom, minhag, now, by the way, custom and law become very blurry sometimes because we have so much. For Reform congregations in North America to begin their Sabbath morning, Shabbat morning services, Shachrit, at 10 a.m. or later. Some actually start at 9:30 like ours does. This custom is no accident, and it did not emerge for reasons of mere convenience. We have established it in order to facilitate a larger attendance at worship services, which enables more people to fulfill the mitzvah, the commandment, of Tfilah b'tzibur, the traditional Jewish preference of public over private prayer. Remember, I might have mentioned this before, the quorum for public prayer is 10, okay? Yet, alongside this positive goal, our late starting times ensure that the congregation will recite the central rubrics of the morning's liturgy, the Shema and the prayer, that big section in the middle that was mentioned, at an hour later than is prescribed for them according to the codified law. This fact might lead to two conclusions. On the one hand, it might suggest that our prayers, because we say them late, are invalid in the eyes of Jewish law, because most Orthodox services are going to start at 8:30 in the morning, something like that. On the one hand, it might suggest that because we say them late, they're invalid. On the other hand, it might raise the suspicion that Reform Judaism is indifferent to the question of proper times for prayer, which would mean that it is of no consequence whether the synagogue schedules its morning prayer at 11:30 or at noon or even later. Both these conclusions, in our view, are erroneous. To establish this point, we want to first consider the general issue. So here's the bottom. Does the Jewish legal and liturgical tradition offer support for our minhag, our tradition, to begin services late in the morning? We will then turn to the case at hand. Given that we do begin services during the late morning, do we nonetheless recognize a time limit, a terminus ad quem, beyond which a morning service should not begin? Okay. The morning Shema. Now see, this is the bottom. The Shema, according to our rabbinic tradition, is to be recited when you lie down and when you rise up, that is in the evening and in the morning. Although the precise time for the recitation of the Shema is the subject of dispute in the Mishnah, and we talked about that, the settled Jewish law, settled halacha, is that one must recite it by the end of the third hour of the day, the time by which the vast majority of the community have arisen from sleep. The hour to which our sources refer is a temporal hour. That is a segment consisting of 1/12 of the period of daylight on a particular day. Thus, the end of the third hour is equivalent to the first quarter of the daylight period. As we note above, few congregations ever recite the Shema before that time. The tradition, however, is more complex, and it goes on and on and on to talk about it. And if I don't skip this page, we won't make it on time. Okay. I want to go with Maimonides from interpretation, though. He holds that by the end of the third hour rule is a rabbinic stringency imposed upon the basic Torah understanding, which requires only that the Shema be said during the daytime, the time of rising up. So you could say it all day, right? Most authorities do not accept this interpretation, okay? And so again, back and forth we go. So where's the center? Where's the middle? Where's the agreed upon understanding? Okay. There's an undeniable existence of this interpretation, along with the fact that it is not forbidden to recite the Shema and its blessings after the end of the third hour. That offers support for us doing it at 10 or so. Yeah. Okay. In this case, however, the congregation does not have a regular Shabbat morning service. They only have it when a young man or woman becomes bat mitzvah. Given that these services by their nature are special events, there would be no objection to scheduling them later than the usual starting time, provided that they remain morning services. That is, the congregation should be able to recite both the Shema and the center part of the service before noon. This suggests a starting time of no later than 11:30. And finally, all the above applies only if it is truly impossible or unfeasible for the grandfather to be awakened early to be brought to the synagogue. In the event that he can arrive by the normal starting time, we should not delay the beginning of services. So now the Reform community is sounding like the Orthodox, right? Because we have to hold to something, because otherwise the breadth of our interpretation becomes so wide we don't even know where we are anymore. This last point deserves emphasis. We want to do everything we can to respond to this family's special situation. At the same time, a large part of becoming a bat mitzvah is the acceptance of Jewish communal responsibilities. This right here is the balance between what we call keva and kavanah, between structure and passion. Obviously, the stuff about the grandfather is all emotion. This is the structure. And once we start breaking the structure, then it isn't structure anymore. And it becomes loose, and it becomes fragile and thin and can break apart. And so these are the things that the Reform, that all the interpretations tried to balance. And all of this, my friends, is Torah. There we go. Questions?
You froze.
Uh-oh.
I did?
Yeah, okay, you're back.
I'm back. I figured. Okay. Hi.
Hi.
That was amazing.
That was a lot in a little time.
I'm breathless.
Pardon me?
Give us a
I'm
quiz.
breathless.
Yeah, me
So
too.
I have a question.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. In your tradition, your Reformed tradition, how seriously are these rules, these commandments followed on a regular daily basis?
Well, it depends who you're talking. You know, there's a spectrum, right? There's a horizon. Obviously, for the Orthodox, they do it every day.
Yes.
Period.
Yes.
The conservative movement will have some group emendations for the movement that they've made, right? And they will do it a little bit differently. Okay, they won't hold people so strictly. The Reform movement hopes that people do something. I'll give you, my tradition is that I do a little bit of a truncated prayer in the morning when I walk the dog, and at night when I walk the dog. Now tonight my dog's having a sleepover with my son and my daughter-in-law, so what am I going to do?
You're on your own.
I'm on my own. I can still get it done. And I do say the Shema in the morning. I do say the Shema at night. That way.
But
Now
that's-
it's not exactly at the time, right?
Mhm.
But given that breadth of, at the pinpoint time, but given the breadth that the rabbis gave us to do it in a more relaxed fashion, in a more liberal fashion, a time when you really can, that's what I do. That's a good question. Thank you, Virginia. Anybody else? Catch your breath.
All right. right, Neil, I'm going to stop recording and we can
Okay.
if we wish, but let's just do that. So
Good night, everybody who's watching it another time. Good morning, everybody who's watching it another time. Odavo shalom aleinu, Odavo shalom aleinu, Yavo shalom aleinu ve'al kulam.